Hi, everyone. Lisa Senecal here, and back again. So excited to have Andrew Watkins. Thank
Hello.
you. Um, so we have a new SCOTUS case to talk about today, which is seems like they're trying to decide whether or not it's worthwhile to continue having a separation of church and state. Is-
Well, that's always been one of the goals of Christian nationalism, and that is baked into Project 2025. So, for some background on me, for people who haven't met me before, I grew up in rural South Carolina and went to a Christian nationalist church and school in the 70s and 80s. My parents put me in one in kindergarten, and I graduated from there. And so I was fully indoctrinated in Christian nationalism as a child. And one of the things that they teach is a flipping of separation of church and state. If you went to a normal, not Christian nationalist school and you learned history or learned about civics, you learned that the separation of church and state was designed to protect the state from the church, that the founders did not want to have an established religion. So, and our country was a product of the Enlightenment, where people had endured hundreds and hundreds of years of religious wars. So they wanted to have a firm wall of separation between the state and the church so that they weren't telling people how to worship and what to believe. That's not what I learned in Christian Nationalist Church and School. I learned that the founders were all Christians and they founded the nation to be a Christian nation, and the separation of church and state was designed to protect the church from the state. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, has gone on the record saying that version and others of them, but he's a big Christian nationalist, so he believes that it's that and openly says so. So establishing a Christian nationalist religion was what Christian nationalists have been indoctrinated to believe the founders intended to do. So I hope that helps people understand where Christian nationalists come at this from. It's not correct, and it doesn't make any sense if you've not heard it before. But that's how they're coming at this.
I understand how people who are steeped in Christian nationalism could come to believe that argument if it's all they've ever heard.
Mhm.
But that kind of goes out the window for people like Mike Johnson, who we hope he has actually read the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and
Well, he's an attorney. We certainly, he got through law school. We certainly hope he
right.
learned a
And
lot about
yeah,
those things.
all these folks do take an oath to the Constitution when
Right.
they're sworn in. So, I hope most of them have at least given a cursory glance to the Bill of Rights if they haven't been able to make it all the way through. Our First Amendment says that the state will not establish a religion. So how does someone like Mike Johnson, what is the contorted interpretation that lets you believe that those words don't actually mean what they say?
Well, to answer that, I'm going to talk first about how Christian nationalists interpret the Bible. Many of them prefer the King James version of the Bible because, it's Elizabethan English, it's hard to read. Lots of people in these congregations can't understand it, so they have to go to their dictatorial pastors and have the pastors tell them what it means, what the King James Version means. So that was the holiest of holy Bibles when I was a little Christian nationalist child. When I had to memorize chunks of the Bible, that's what I had to memorize and quote in front of classes. So they keep control of what the meaning of the Bible is by picking that version or one of the harder translations for people to read and understand. So that they have to keep coming back to their pastor dictators, because all these churches are run by pastor dictators. It's one of the reasons a dictator appeals to this crowd, because they're used to it.
Yeah.
So they have to hear what the Bible means from him. And the pastor dictator always sets himself up to be the only authority on what those verses mean. When Leonard Leo hatched the idea of originalism in interpreting the Constitution, he applied that logic that only the pastor dictator, only certain people speak through, God only speaks through Christian nationalists, only speaks through certain people and tells us what the Bible means. And we're the only people who can interpret it correctly. So the concept of originalism, as I explain it to people, is taking that trick with the Bible that they do for their indoctrination and applying it to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. You can't, if you argue with a Christian nationalist about what a Bible verse means, and there are hundreds of Bible verses that lots of Christians can't agree on what the verse means, who's going to solve that argument? Because, faith isn't this thing where God comes down from heaven and says, Andrew, you're right, and Lisa, you're wrong.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. And they've done the same thing with originalism. It's the same thing, because we can't dig up the founders and drag them out of their graves and ask them what they were thinking and feeling when they wrote those documents. Some of them left diaries. There were some contemporaneous accounts of what people said and how they argued and whatever, but we can't really ask them what they meant. So it's the same thing that they're doing with originalism. So someone like Mike Johnson believes that because he is an originalist, he has a better handle on what the founders meant, just like he has a better handle on what God means in the Bible, because God speaks through him. And if I say, well, I'm a Christian, well, you're not a Christian nationalist, so God speaks through you imperfectly. You're also a woman, so God really doesn't speak through women in Mike Johnson's version of Christian nationalism. That was a long-winded answer, but I hope it makes sense.
It makes as much sense as something that doesn't make sense can mean. I think,
yeah.
So who gets to decide whether or not someone is an originalist? Because I can say I'm an originalist and I have a completely different understanding of what it is the founders meant when they wrote the First Amendment. So I know I'm a woman. Let's pretend let's pretend I count and that I'm a man, just for a minute. So I'm a white man, and I have proclaimed myself an originalist. Do I get to have all new interpretations of what the Bill of Rights or what the Constitution means, or only some people get to see that?
Agree with them, you do.
Okay. All right.
If you disagree with them, then you're not really an originalist, or you haven't spent enough time being steeped in originalist indoctrination, because it is an indoctrination process that the Federalist Society puts their attorneys through to be able to put these things out of their mouths and have these interpretations that really don't make sense to anyone who didn't go through that process. So that's part of why the Federalist Society exists, or initially did, was to indoctrinate attorneys through that type of thinking. So you might be an originalist if you can convince them that you agree with them, but you can't disagree with them and be an originalist.
Okay. All right. So it's a totally made up thing. We're just going to leave it at that. It's they believe
Leonard Leo made it up. Yes.
Yes. All right. So Leonard Leo made this up, and now we have a case before the Supreme Court, and we have people on the Supreme Court who also subscribe to this originalist type of interpretation, and don't have the strong lines between that strong boundary between church and state that has sort of been the history of the United States. That has been the accepted practice, and this originalism is a departure from history, which again doesn't make any sense, but okay, we're going to go with it because they have a lot of power now. So we're going to have to deal with the fact that originalism exists and it has real influence. So Oklahoma has a charter school that
It's
is
an online charter school that is Catholic, St. Isidore.
right.
This case was conceived by our favorite person we were just talking about, Leonard Leo.
Surprise!
To try to get this argument before this particular Supreme Court. For people who don't know a lot about the Supreme Court and who's on it, we hear their names, but we don't hear a lot about what they believe. So the 6 Supreme Court justices that are conservatives are all Catholics. And at least 2 of them attend an Opus Dei affiliated Catholic church in Virginia. So Alito and Clarence Thomas go to the same church.
And if you don't know what Opus Dei is, Google it and read up a little bit. It's it'll scare the pants off you.
It's the Christian nationalist version of Catholicism, but there are other flavors of it. We've talked about that on other shows. So, all 6 of them are affiliated with that line of thinking. So there is no separation of church and state to an Opus Dei Catholic. Opus Dei Catholicism would really like to take the world back to 1,000 years ago when a few wealthy people owned everything and the church was all tied up in that and was tied up in the ruling class and made lots of money from that. And the rest of us were serfs. It's, to me, new feudalism. And they constantly went on crusades and tried to take over the world with Catholicism and burn people at the stake for being heretics. And a heretic could be a woman who they didn't like, so they accused her of being a witch, or a Jew, or someone who refused to convert to Catholicism and renounce whatever it was they were doing. That was all heresy. Just several hundred years ago in Europe. It's one of the reasons that people came to the New World was to escape that mentality. But that's the mentality that Opus Dei Catholics have. We are the original faith. We are the only one true faith. We are the original church, and everyone on the planet needs to be brought back to the one true original faith. All this Protestantism is bullshit. All these other religions that people practice elsewhere in the world are not acceptable. And so this is how these justices have been indoctrinated in their churches. And it's how the Federalist Society allows whatever flavor of Christian nationalism you adhere to inject that into the Constitution and into our founding and into our laws. So all 6 of them believe that we were founded as a Christian nation, and we need to be forced to go back to that and live that way, and that our laws should be drawn from their interpretation of the Bible. And whether we believe them or not, it doesn't matter. It's God's word. And we should all be living by it, whether we want to or not. And so this Catholic school from Oklahoma case is an effort to force taxpayers to use public money to pay for a Catholic private Christian school in the state of Oklahoma.
And I believe it was Elena Kagan who made the sort of what I think is the fundamental point in the arguments that happened yesterday, that the church in this case is not being denied a right that everyone else has. It's being denied a right that no other school that gets public funding has, which is to have state-funded religious education.
Yes, but
doesn't seem like all the justices are going to go along with that interpretation, though.
Barrett's not ruling. She recused herself because one of her best good friends in the world is involved in this movement to try to tear down this wall between separation of church and state. So she, showed a tiny bit of ethics and recused herself. Robert's arguments or questions seem to be a little more skeptical.
Mhm.
So it really is possible that we could have a tie and a split evenly here. And then the lower court's ruling would stand and the school would not be allowed. Because what happened, for people who don't know about this case, is it was denied at the initial level and said this is clear, unequivocal violation of the separation of church and state.
Right.
Absolutely.
Oklahoma law is very clear on
And
no funding.
the Oklahoma Attorney General argued against it. And I mean, he's a Christian and openly so, and argued and said this is absolutely a violation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. It got to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. They said the same thing. This is absolutely not allowed. We don't even need to spend a lot of time on this. It's clear that this is not allowed. But we get to the Supreme Court, and really the Supreme Court should have said, this is a waste of our time.
Right. We're not going to take this case.
Because this is so clearly unconstitutional. But they took it because the case was designed for this moment by Leonard Leo. So they took it, and now we'll see what they do with it. Brett Kavanaugh, and I can't even see his name and read anything he says without seeing him sniveling and crying and going, I like beer.
Yeah, I know.
But,
That's what I hear in my head. Why are you screaming about beer in a Senate confirmation here?
I'm supposed to take anything he says seriously, and all I can do is I like beer. But anyway, so he clearly says that in his questioning that you can't discriminate against religious people with public funding. That denying this school public funding, taxpayer dollars, is discriminating against religion. But when Elena Kagan asked the ADF attorney, Alliance Defending Freedom attorney, who was there, what would you say if a Muslim school wanted to do this? What would you say if a Jewish school wanted to do this? What would you say if a Unitarian school wanted to do this? And she didn't include all those. I'm just giving people flavors of what could be done. He said, well, but that's not really what we're arguing about here today.
But it is.
But it is.
It is.
So, when they're screwed to the wall, and this happened also, this is going to be their standard answer until somebody really screws them to the wall and makes them answer. Because last month or so, in Indiana, they passed a state resolution proclamation that said Jesus is Lord of Indiana. And they were arguing about that in the Senate, in the Congress of the state. I don't know what they call them in Indiana. And a Democrat asked the sponsor of the bill, well, what if a group of us wanted to come and say Allah is God, or there is no Lord, or, and have that proclamation? And he said the same thing. Well, that's not what's on the table here. That's not what we're discussing.
Right. So
his non-answer means we would totally oppose that.
Right.
And we need to start making them say that. In my view, Justice Kagan didn't go far enough in questioning him because she needed to make him say that. And, that creates problems for them going forward. So we need to start making them say, we are the only thing that will be allowed.
Yeah, I have the same frustration listening to arguments in mainly the Supreme Court that I do very often listening to journalists allow people to completely evade giving an answer to a difficult question. And if they ask the question twice and the person dodges 2 times in a row, then apparently that's like a get out of jail free card, and you just go on to the next question. And you don't, to me, that's more reason. They're signaling that this is an answer they don't want to have to give the American people, whether it is before the court or before a journalist.
Right. I was not trained in journalism. I wanted to be a journalist when I was a kid, but that wasn't acceptable to my parents. So it's funny to me now that I'm kind of sort of doing that.
You're
But,
doing a lot of
even,
things that probably your parents weren't expecting you to do.
and are horrified by, but
Yeah.
we don't need to talk about that. So, but one of the things that I know about journalists is if somebody tries to dodge a question, I'm gonna latch onto that thing like a pit bull, and I'm gonna be like, what is the answer? And we're not moving on until you give me an answer. I think one of the problems is that American media, there's always been this idea that we're not supposed to call out and question religious fanaticism in others. And so one of the reasons Christian nationalists have gotten as far as they have is because it's rude and it's unseemly to call somebody a religious fanatic, to call them an extremist, to it's an insult to their faith and their religion. And people on the left, we just want to live and let live. So we don't want to call people fanatics and extremists and radicalized crazy people. So, they've gotten this far because people won't push back on that radicalization and that extremism. Journalists don't know how to question them. They don't. There are a few journalists who came out of Liberty University and actually considered it to be a bad experience, but learned how to be journalists. And so some of them know how to ask questions and get answers to questions, but corporate media journalists do not. And so, one of the things that they need to be asked is, what religions will be allowed to have schools like this? What gods are we going to have state proclamations for? If we're going to have the 10 Commandments displayed in every classroom, then we also want a copy of the Jewish version of them from the Torah. And we also want to ask Muslim students and parents what is representative of their faith. And that's what we should be forcing them to do. But we just don't do anything, and we don't push back. One of the things that I think would be so great if we could get the factions of Christian nationalism arguing with each other would be to go to Sam Alito and say, is Mike Johnson going to heaven? Because they don't believe the same thing about who's going to heaven, and each believes the other one, because their faith is wrong, is not going to heaven. So we need to get them to start admitting that, J.D. Vance doesn't really think Marge Green is going to heaven.
Right.
Because, and they passionately don't believe that the other people are going to heaven. Amongst themselves, they will cut those other factions to shreds. And we need to get them to start doing that in public.
Yeah, that would be great.
Asking those questions and sitting there and saying, we're not going to stop on this until you answer the question.
Yeah, it was a huge disappointment in multiple confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices now that the left, I think, is so terribly afraid of being painted as being godless, that they're the heathens, that they will not ask those difficult questions and really press people who they are questioning for the highest court in our country about whether or not they prioritize the Constitution over their religious beliefs.
And they do not.
And
the
they
Bible
do not.
is it.
And they all shy away from asking questions about religion. But I promise you, if there was a Muslim who was nominated for the Supreme Court, that person would be asked questions by the GOP about how their religious beliefs were going to impact their decisions.
And they would be. And they would probably be harassed by it and not confirmed because of it. The GOP would not countenance having a Muslim Supreme Court justice, or probably, I don't know if there are any appellate court judges that are, but they're not going to confirm somebody like that. So it's a real problem that we have. I mean, there's even a better example than that of something that just happened last week, or I think happened on Monday. It's Friday. So Reverend William Barber, who's a famous progressive minister, has an ecumenical group of people that he prays with every Monday. and they decided to pray in the Capitol Rotunda this past Monday. They weren't making noise. They weren't demonstrating with signs and whatever. They just gathered in a circle and started praying. And they were arrested by the Capitol Police for having an unlawful presentation, in the Capitol Rotunda. Raphael Warnock was arrested in 2016, 2017, 2018 for doing the same thing before he was a senator. So, during both of this current president's regimes, they would arrest progressive ministers in the Capitol Rotunda for praying. During Biden's term, there was a Christian nationalist fanatical performer, pastor. I cannot remember his name because I try so hard not to remember who these people are and have to have their names and faces in my head all the time, but very fanatical one. And he was giving concerts in the Capitol Rotunda, not just praying over in the corner, giving concerts. I mean, there's a picture online of Lauren Boebert having some sort of charismatic experience to one of these concerts. And they were never arrested for having an unlawful presentation and an unimproved presentation in the Capitol. And if they had been, Christian nationalists would have been like, Christian persecution, we're being persecuted, this is wrong. But when they're arresting, progressive ministers, an ecumenical prayer service, they say nothing.
So it's possible this is going to end up being deadlocked in a decision if John Roberts is capable of doing what he used to have the capacity to do, which was to some degree set aside his personal beliefs and rule based on law and precedent. But this won't be the last case, correct? They'll find another way to come back before the Supreme Court at some point while the court's still configured the way it is, and find a case they can bring that Amy Coney Barrett isn't going to have to recuse herself from the next time.
Right. I mean, there are two other church-state separation cases on the Supreme Court docket this term, and I can't remember off the top of my head what they are. This one was just argued this week. So they have other opportunities, certainly. I mean, in my mind, abortion bans are a church-state separation issue, but nobody ever argues them that way. I don't care what you think the Bible says about abortion or anything else. I don't have to live by your interpretation of a faith document. So, to me, that is a church-state separation issue. But, to them, it's not. So I wish we would approach more things from that perspective, again, because we need to be calling out the fanaticism and the radicalization of this group of people, that their full intention is to force us all to live under their interpretation of the Bible. And we have examples of that on this planet right now in other countries that practice a different religion, and so we know what a religious run government looks like and what the people there look like and what their lives are like. So, white people can sit and say, oh, that won't ever happen here, but it is happening here. And Christian nationalists are determined to try to make it happen.
The people of Iran also believed that it could never happen there. And
they did.
And have been, cast back to the Stone Age from a very modern society.
And they're basically enslaved in their own homes and have no rights. And, that would be a wet dream for these Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
And as hard as it is for a lot of Americans to have that kind of imagination, but as someone who grew up in it, that is what they want. That's one reason I can't. I live out of the country now because I saw this happening and was like, I worked 20 years to get out of this, and I will not live like that again. So I know what they intend to do to people.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that and I think this is part of our lack of civic education now, that people don't fully understand that you have to look at the big picture when you're protecting rights. And even when, following the cases of the ACLU is a good example. There are cases that the ACLU has taken over the years that have clients who make me want to scream and vomit. But if rights are not protected for all people, then none of us have rights. And the same thing
And
goes for these religious decisions, that it can just as easily in 100 years from now be a different religion that has built up power, and it will not be a fantasy about Christian persecution, but it could actually be happening, and we will have set a precedent that the state can establish a religion.
right.
And there's just no foresight into, I guess they assume once they get power, they'll just always have it and they don't have to worry
They
about
won't lose it. They don't know a lot about history and the 30 Years War in Europe and how many millions of people died, and that was a religious war that went on for decades. And that people will eventually rise up and say, I'm not going to live the way you tell me to live, just because, and that's one thing I want to say and make sure I say very strongly as we work toward the end of this. But Christian nationalists have a right to believe whatever they want. They have a right to worship wherever they want. I've told my parents, if you want to go to church every day, I'm not arguing with you about your faith. You can believe whatever you want. You can believe the Bible says whatever you want. I have no problem with you practicing your religion however you want. But when you try to make me practice your religion however you want, I have a problem with that.
Yeah.
So, and that's what Christian nationalists are trying to do, is make all of us practice their religion however they say and however they decide and want and adjudicate.
Well, let's hope the Supreme Court is deadlocked on this one, and it goes back to the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruling, which ruled and this is Oklahoma, folks. We're not talking about Connecticut or California or Vermont.
This is the state where the superintendent of education said, we have to have a Bible in every classroom, and then tried to buy, gold-plated, made in China Trump Bibles. So, this is a very, very Christian nationalist conservative state.
Yeah, and that court still got it right. So we'll have you back when there's a decision and when these other cases come before the court, because we have to keep talking about all of this. So thank you again for being here with us, Andra. Thanks everybody for being here with us. We will let you go enjoy the rest of your Sunday. However it is you enjoy your Sundays, please do that.
Bye, everyone.